The room was bright and quiet as Lyra stepped through the doorway. Her long silver hair brushed her shoulders as her wide green eyes scanned the human base for the first time. Her heart beat fast, not from fear but from something strange something. New. The translator in her ear clicked softly and the words of the human officer came through in her own tongue. Welcome, Lyra. He said his smile was warm and easy. My name is Mason. She nodded slowly, unsure of how much to trust the machine between them. The translator device was old tech, but used by both sides since the peace treaty was signed just 2 weeks ago. Lyra had trained for this mission on the moon base of Zarin, where she learned human customs through filtered data and incomplete visuals. The truth was that no one really knew what humans were like up close now. Here she was standing in front of one. He looked different from the images, taller, stronger, with warm brown skin and deep, quiet eyes. His voice had a calm rhythm that made her stomach twist for reasons she could not name. The base was small with 10 rooms, linked by narrow halls and soft lights. Her quarters were next to his, not by accident. The team had placed them together to test bonding between species, not emotional bonding, of course, only cooperation and trust. That night, as she unpacked her things, her translator buzzed again. It was supposed to give her updates, but instead it whispered a strange sentence. He is watching you because he feels the pull. She turned sharply, her heart racing. Mason stood at his door, holding 2 cups of some steaming drink. He smiled again and held one toward Harry. Thought you might like to try this? She took it slowly. Their fingers brushed for a second. The translator clicked softly. Again, he wants you close. Lyra blinked and stared at the cup. Was that what he really said, or just the device choosing words again? They sat down at a small table in the shared dining area. The room was warm and the drink was too sweet, but she said nothing. She watched him speak with his hands, smiling gently, asking about her world, her family, her language. She answered carefully, trying to avoid mistakes. But every now and then the translator twisted his words just enough to make her blush. He said you shine like a crystal under moonlight. He said he dreams of your voice. He said he wants to bond with you under the stars. Was this real, or was the device broken? Lyra felt heat rise to her cheeks. She turned her head, but Mason seemed relaxed and casual, like nothing strange had been said. After the meal, he stood up and stretched his arms, then looked at her with a strange softness in his eyes. Sleep well, Lyra. The translator buzzed again. Come be near me tonight. She froze, staring at him, unsure of what he meant, but he had already turned to walk away. In her room, she sat for a long time, thinking, trying to make sense of the words, the gestures, the feelings in her chest. Could this be a human game, or did the translator carry his real feelings? Hours past, the lights dimmed outside. She heard his footsteps, soft, and even then they stopped. A knock. She stood slowly and opened the door. Mason stood there, shirtless and calm, his hand behind his back, holding a small glowing stone. The humans called it a comfort crystal, used to calm nerves before rest. He held it out to her. You looked sad earlier. I thought this might help. Translator buzzed again, but this time the words were slow and deep. I wish to share warmth with you. She reached out and took the stone. Her fingers brushed his again, and this time she did not pull away. He stepped closer, only a little, and waited. She looked into his eyes and felt something open inside her. Not fear, not confusion, but a strange kind of peace. Without speaking, she turned and let him follow her into the room. They sat on the floor, close, but not touching the warmth of the stone. Between them, no words, now only the translator blinking softly between them. She leaned against him, gently, her head on his shoulder. His breath was steady and slow. She closed her eyes and wondered, was this what the old songs meant when they spoke of quiet trust between stars, or was she walking into something deeper than either of them could understand? The translator stayed quiet now, as if it too had nothing left to say. The light from the ceiling glowed soft and white as Mason slowly opened his eyes, his body still heavy from sleep. His arm rested gently along the side of the bed, but something felt different. He turned his head and saw Lyra sitting at the edge of the bed, fully dressed, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap, her silver hair falling like silk over her shoulders. Did not look at him, her eyes fixed on the floor, the small glowing stone still resting in her hand, its light now dim and pulsing slowly. Good morning, he said, his voice still thick from sleep. The translator responded with a pause, then spoke in her native tongue. The human greets you with comfort. Lyra did not answer at first, her thoughts spinning like a storm. She felt warmth in her chest, but also something heavy. Her mind kept returning to the words The translator had spoken the night before. I wish to share warmth with you. Had he truly said that, or had the device made its own choice? Had she misread the moment she stood and turned slowly? Her eyes met his, and for a long time neither of them spoke. Mason sat up, his expression calm, but unsure. He reached for a cup of water and offered it to her, but she raised her hand in a soft gesture of refusal. Last night, she began, her voice quiet and loaded. You mean what you said? Mason blinked. He tilted his head in confusion. Mean what exactly? Translator clicked and spoke in her ear. He asks what words you speak of. Lara's fingers tightened around the stone, her mind replaying every look, every word, every moment. The way you came to my room, the way you offered your comfort crystal, the words the translator said. He looked away for a moment, rubbing the back of his neck. I came because you looked alone, not because I expected anything. The translator gave. Harry came because your eyes pulled me in, and I could not stay away. Her heart raced. She did not know what to believe anymore. She stepped closer now, her voice steady. You said you wished to share warmth with me. Did you mean it in the way your kind bonds? Mason's eyes widened for a moment, then softened. Lyra, I did not say those exact words. Her breath caught. Then what did you say? I said you looked cold, and I wanted to help you sleep better. The translator had twisted the meaning, turned kindness into something deeper. She turned away, her hands trembling. I trusted the device. I trusted the words it gave me. Mason stood up slowly, careful not to startle her. He stepped forward and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. I never wanted to hurt you. Lyra, the translator, remained silent now, as if unsure what to say. I need to know, she said finally. I need to understand if what happened last night was a mistake or a step towards something real. Mason nodded and stepped back, giving her space. Let us talk without the translator, just for a while. Let us try to speak with only what we feel. She agreed and placed the translator on the table. It blinked once and went dark. They sat on the floor again, facing each other. Mason drew simple shapes in the air with his hands, a circle, a star, a question mark. Lyra followed slowly, her eyes watching his every movement. She made a heart with her fingers, then pointed to herself, then to him. Mason hesitated, then mirrored her motion. They both smiled, small and unsure, but something passed between them in that quiet moment. Not a lie, not confusion, just the start of something. A bond built on choice, not error. She felt her body relax for the first time since waking. She took his hand slowly and placed the glowing crystal between them again. This time the light pulsed in rhythm with their heartbeats. Outside, the hallway buzzed with morning calls and distant footfalls, but inside the room it was calm. Lyra knew there were questions still buried, deep things to ask and truths to face, but for now this silence felt more honest than any machine could ever give. Mason looked at her and spoke softly. If the translator fails again, I still want to understand you. She smiled and answered in her own language, knowing he would not understand. Then try with your heart. The machine stayed off, but their meaning was clear. Something had begun last night, not just a mistake, not just a glitch, but a small thread between the man now. They both held the ends tightly, hoping not to let go even if the words failed again tomorrow. The halls of the station were colder now, or maybe it only felt that way to Lyra as she walked past the crew quarters with her head slightly lowered. The translator rested in her ear, but she kept it silent, unsure if she could trust it again. Her mind replayed the night she spent beside Mason, every breath, every look, every word that might not have been real. Whispers followed her now, soft and quick like wind in narrow spaces. Her people stared longer than usual, and the humans too watched her with unreadable expressions. She entered the training bay to stretch her limbs and clear her thoughts. Mason was already there, lifting crates with smooth, controlled movements. His shirt clung to his skin, and a small smile crossed his face when he saw her. Good morning, Lyra, he said as he dropped the crate onto the floor with a soft thud. She nodded, not speaking, just moved beside him and picked up a crate of her own. Their hands brushed, and that single touch made her heart jump again. 2 officers from her side entered the bay, their eyes locked on her, and one of them, Kel, stepped closer with a stiff posture. Walk with me, he said in their native tongue, ignoring Mason completely. Lyra followed him into the side hallway, away from the others. Kel's voice dropped to a whisper as his eyes narrowed. You were seen leaving the humans' quarters. She opened her mouth, but no words came. He continued before she could speak. You are part of the treaty team, not a pleasure companion. Do not Forget your role here. Her stomach turned and her hands curled into fists. I followed the translator, she said. Finally, it told me his words. Kel laughed cold and sharp. Then maybe your trust in human-made machines is the problem, she returned to her. Room later, feeling empty and uncertain, her translator blinked with an unread message. She hesitated, then played it. It was from Mason. Meet me in the comms room at 1700. We need to talk. Her breath caught again. He never said we need to talk before. Was this serious, or did he know about the whispers? The comms room was quiet when she entered, dimly lit with a soft hum in the walls. Mason sat on the edge of the main console, his face unreadable. He motioned for her to sit, and she did. He took a moment, then spoke. Someone reported us. She nodded slowly. I was warned too. They looked at each other for a long time. We are not supposed to be anything more than teammates, he said, his voice calm, but his eyes burning with something deeper. She took a deep breath. Then, what are we, Mason? He looked away, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a small flat chip. I ran a check on the translator logs, he said. Finally, the words you heard that night, they were never spoken. Her blood went cold. So it was all false. He stood and paced slowly. I do not know if the glitch was random or if someone tampered with it, but what happened between us was not what I said. She stared at the floor. Then everything was a mistake. He stopped and turned toward her. No, I said other things that night, maybe not the same words, but I meant something. I just never had the right way to say it. Lyra stood slowly, her heart pounding. So what now? He stepped closer, his voice low. Now we stop using the translator for things that matter. They stared at each other, the silence more honest than any translation. Then a sudden alarm rang through the station and a voice called over the intercom. Lyra and Mason, report to command deck, mission detail, urgent. They looked at each other again and left without speaking on the command deck. The officers briefed them quickly. A crashed cargo pod had been spotted on a nearby moon, and the team needed 2 quick responders. Only 1 pod available, only 2 seats. They both volunteered without hesitation. As they boarded the small craft, Lyra looked at Mason alone again. He nodded and smiled. No translators this time, just us. She smiled too, and as the pod launched into space toward the frozen moon, her mind burned with new thoughts, not about the glitch, not about the mistake, but about the truth she now wanted to find with her own ears, with her own heart. And maybe, just maybe, with him beside her, always watching, always listening, without the need for machines to speak for them ever again. The pod landed with a soft jolt on the icy surface of the moon, its engines humming down to a slow, silent stop. The outside world was white and endless, with jagged crystal peaks and frozen winds that howled even through the thick walls of the small craft. Inside, Lyra pulled her coat tighter around her body, her breath forming light clouds as she looked at Mason, who checked the systems with steady hands. The heat unit inside the pod flickered low, its signal weak from the crash. We need to find the supply beacon, he said calmly, pointing at a blinking dot on the map. But we also need to stay close, or this cold will eat us alive. Lyra nodded, but said nothing, her thoughts still tangled from the last few days. The translator was off, locked in a storage bin, as agreed between them, but without it, every word felt like a test. They stepped out into the snow, walking side by side, their boots crunching softly with every step. The wind bit at their skin, even through the layers of clothing, but they kept moving toward the signal. After 30 minutes, they reached the wreckage, a small metallic crate half buried in ice, its surface dented but glowing faintly with power. Mason knelt and began prying it open while Lyra kept watch, her eyes scanning the white hills. Once the crate was opened, they pulled out sealed rations, blankets, and a portable heat coil. Mason smiled and gave her a thumbs up, but Lyra only nodded and turned her eyes to the sky. A storm was coming, the kind that made even thick armor feel like paper. We need to shelter now, she said, her voice low but clear. Back inside the pod, Mason lit the heat coil, but the warmth barely filled the space. Lyra sat beside him, knees pulled to her chest, hands trembling from the fading cold. He looked at her and slowly removed his gloves, then his outer coat, and wrapped it around her shoulders. She stared at him, her eyes wide, unsure what he was trying to say without the device. Mason pointed to her, then to himself, then brought his hands together, palm to palm together. She hesitated, then slowly leaned into him, her head resting against his chest, his heartbeat steady like the sound of falling rain back on her. Homeworld silence filled the pod, but it was not empty. It was full of questions unspoken, full of thoughts neither dared to say. Mason gently reached into his pack and pulled out a small metal pen and an old paper sheet. He began drawing simple shapes. A moon, a flame, a pair of eyes. He pointed to the moon. Then to the outside, then to the flame, then to the heat coil, then finally to the eyes and to Hershey. Looked at him confused, then reached for the pen and drew a heart, then pointed to her chest. He smiled and placed his hand over hers, then took the pen and wrote one word while she paused, her breath catching in her throat, then slowly drew a line between his drawing of the eyes and her heart. Because I saw something in youth meaning hung in the air between them, heavy and soft at the same time. He gently took the pen again and wrote another word. Real. She nodded and whispered the same word, though she knew he might not understand the sound. The feeling was clear. They sat like that for a long time, not speaking, not moving, just sharing warmth and watching the storm rage outside the windows. Later, when the winds died down and the night stretched long and quiet, Lyra looked up at him, her voice shaking slightly. Did you ever wonder if it was fate or just a broken machine? Mason looked down at her, his face unreadable. Then he slowly took her hand and pressed it over his heart. I stopped wondering when you stayed. Her eyes shimmered with unshed tears, not of sadness, but of something she never felt before. She leaned in closer, resting her forehead against his, and closed her eyes. The pod was still cold, the world outside still dangerous, but in that small space something had changed, not because of technology, not because of mistranslations, but because they chose to stay close even when they could not fully speak, and maybe that was what mattered more than perfect words ever could. The storm had passed, but the silence that followed felt heavier than snow. Lyra sat by the small window, her eyes fixed on the distant horizon, where ice met the sky. Mason moved behind her, checking the power lines and food packs, but his gaze kept returning to her back. She had not spoken since morning, not even a whisper, her lips pressed tightly as if holding something back, something sharp and heavy. Mason stepped closer and placed a ration bar beside her. Without saying anything, she nodded once, but still did not turn around. He sat across from her in the cramped pod, the warmth from the heat coil now steady but not strong enough to ease the cold between them. Lyra finally spoke, her voice soft like glass about to crack. I did not know what I was doing that night. I trusted the device, I trusted the words it gave me. Mason leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. I know. She looked up, her eyes burning with shame. Then, why did you not stop me? Why did you not say something was wrong? He exhaled and rubbed his hands together before answering. Because I saw you smile, I saw you relax. I thought maybe you just needed closeness after a long day. Maybe we both did. She shook her head slowly. But I thought you were offering something else. I thought it was your way of saying you wanted more. Mason was quiet for a long moment, then he pulled the same pen and paper from before and began to write. Slowly, I never meant to mislead you, never wanted to cross a line you did not choose. He slid the paper across the floor to her. She read it and looked away. Feel foolish? He shook his head and pointed to her heart, then made the gesture for strength. Not foolish, strong. She blinked and let out a shaky breath, then reached for the pen and wrote one sentence carefully in her own language. Then why do I feel like I gave something I cannot take back? Mason stared at the letters, not knowing their meaning but feeling the weight in her voice. He placed his hand gently on hers, then drew a simple shape, a door half open. She watched and tilted her head. What does it mean? He pointed to himself, then to her, then to the door, then drew a small light beyond Ida way forward. She stared at the image, then whispered, you still want to move forward after this? He nodded and slowly wrote another line, only if you do. Lyra closed her eyes for a long time as if listening to something deep inside, then she opened them and whispered yes. Mason gave a small smile, the kind that said more than any device ever could. Later, they stood near the exit door, preparing to return to the ship, their mission complete, the supplies packed, the storm cleared, the path home clear. Before they opened the hatch, Lyra turned and faced him fully, her eyes bright but serious. Promise me no more devices, no more broken machines, no more middle voices, only truth. Mason raised his hand, palm up, as she placed hers against it, their fingers aligned, and still promised. The pod door opened and the wind rushed in, not cold, not cruel, just sharp. With newness, they stepped out together, their boots crunching the snow in rhythm, their shadows long and side by side. Whatever had started from error was now built with choice, and even if the stars above watched in silence, they both knew something had shifted, something real had taken root where lies once bloomed. They walked toward the beacon that would carry them home, not as strangers, not as broken links in a chain of mistakes, but as two hearts who had learned to speak without words and to hear without sound, and that was more powerful than any translation ever made. The ship welcomed them back with warm lights and quiet halls, but not all eyes were kind as Lyra stepped down from the ramp. Her people stood in a tight line, their expressions unreadable, but their posture sharp and closed. Mason followed close behind, unaware of the storm waiting inside the calm. She walked toward her quarters when a voice cut through the silence, sharp and loud. Report to Central Review. She turned and saw Officer Vec, his arms crossed, his eyes fixed on her face with no hint of softness. Mason took a step forward, but she raised a hand, stopping him. "I will go." Alana. Vec led her through the silent halls down into the lower levels where lights hummed and cold steel walls made everything feel like a cage inside the room. 3 elders from her delegation sat behind a curved desk, their eyes glowing softly with the inner light of their rank. One of them spoke without emotion. "Your actions on the moon have reached us from multiple reports." Lyra stood tall, her hands folded behind her back, her heart steady. "I followed the mission. I retrieved the supplies. I returned safely." "That is not what we mean." They pulled up a screen showing images of her and Mason inside the pod, too close, too quiet, too intimate. "You shared space, you shared touch, you shared warmth." She said nothing at first, her eyes calm, her voice flat. "We merely froze. If we had stayed apart, the storm would have ended us both." They leaned forward slightly. "That is not the only concern. Reports say you refused translator use and communicated through unapproved means." Lyra's jaw clenched. "I chose truth over error. I chose trust over malfunction." They whispered among themselves. Then the middle one leaned in. "Do you care for this human?" Lyra did not look away, her voice clear. "I do." The room fell into a heavy silence. Then they dismissed her without another word. She returned to her room, but Mason was already waiting there, his arms crossed, his face tight with concern. "They called me in too." She walked past him, sat on the edge of her bunk, and stared at the floor. "They do not want us to be more than symbols, more than peacekeepers." He sat beside her slowly. "My side is worse." She turned and looked at him. "What do you mean?" He took a deep breath. "Command said I need to distance myself or be reassigned." Her chest tightened. "So they want to break the bond?" He nodded. "I did not agree to anything I told them. The bond is real." She reached for his hand and gripped it tightly. "They fear what they cannot name." Later that night, they met under the old observatory dome, where the stars shone through the clear glass and the world felt distant. Mason held out the small pen again. "Let us write something no one can erase." She smiled and took it, then wrote her name in human letters and passed it to him. He added his name below hers, then drew a line connecting them. Both. She added a small symbol the shape of her home moon, then circled both names with it. They placed the paper inside a small crystal capsule and sealed it, then left it beneath the viewing panel where few would ever find it, not as rebellion but as memory, as proof that something had bloomed in a place meant only for diplomacy. They stood in silence as the stars blinked above, and the future pressed close. Neither spoke of what came next, not the orders, not the threats, not the waiting shadows, only the now, only the bond, only the truth that no one else seemed ready to hear. But they did not need others to understand. They only needed each other to believe. The battlefield burned beneath twin suns, broken ships scattered across black soil, smoke rising into the alien sky. Where once there had been only hope, now there was only chaos. Lyra moved fast, her armor scratched, her breath short, her eyes scanning for survivors. The enemy had struck without warning, breaching the outer rim and crushing the forward post. She heard screams through the cum, some human, some not, but all full of the same pain, the same fear, the same end. She pushed forward over the ridge where shattered metal lay, bent and twisted, a human arm reaching out from the wreckage, fingers bloody and still. Lyra rushed to it, her hands shaking as she gripped the edges of the broken panel and pulled, her heart pounding harder with each breath. Then she saw him, Mason, his eyes half open, his face pale, blood trailing from his temple and smoke rising around his body. No translator, no words, just a whisper from his lips. Her name, Lyra. She dropped beside him, cradling his head, pressing her forehead to his. "Stay awake." He blinked once slowly. "You came back." She nodded, tears running down her cheeks. I never left. She pulled a small med injector from her pouch and pressed it to his side. The light blinked green as the serum pushed through his system. Around them the air shook with another explosion, the sky tearing with fire. Lyra stayed low, pulling him behind a shielded rock, the world spinning around them. His hand found hers, fingers weak but steady. I thought I lost you. She leaned close so he could hear you. Never did. Mason coughed, once blood at the edge of his mouth. They tried to keep us apart. She nodded, but they failed. He smiled weakly. Still no translator, still no kneading. The quiet moments that followed, she patched his wounds as best she could using supplies from her kit, every motion careful, every breath held like a prayer. When the rescue ship arrived an hour later, they lifted him onto a stretcher and secured it inside. Lyra climbed in after him, her hand never leaving his. Back at the medical bay, the doctors worked fast, but she stayed by the glass, watching his heartbeat on the screen, feeling every beat echo in her own chest. When he woke 2 days later, she was still there, her hand resting on the same capsule they had hidden beneath the observatory dome. Now worn from her grip, he opened his eyes and smiled at her, the kind of smile that needed no machine, no voice, no words. She sat beside him and placed the capsule in his hand. Remember this? He nodded slowly and opened it, unfolding the paper with their names and the moon symbol still clear despite the folds. I never forgot. She leaned in close, her voice soft but steady. They may not understand, they may try to rewrite what happened, but this is ours, this is real. He closed his fingers around the paper and held it against his chest. When the time came for their review, the council stood in silence as Lyra entered, her back straight, her eyes calm. Mason followed beside her, his steps slower, but his presence strong. You defied our orders, the lead elder said. You ignored protocol, you acted outside your role. Lyra raised her voice. I followed my heart. You compromised the mission. No, she stepped forward, placing the capsule on the table. We completed every mission, we protected every life, and we built something they all fear because it was not written in their codes. The elder leaned forward, his face unreadable. And what exactly did you build? She looked at Mason, then back at them. Trust. The room stayed silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air. After the hearing, they walked together through the long hall back to the docks, where new missions waited, where choices still hung like stars above dark roads. He looked at her and smiled. So what now? She took his hand and pulled him close. Now we speak our own language, no device, no rules, just us. And they walked forward, 2 voices, 1 story, no translation needed anymore, because they had already heard the truth in each other long before the first word was ever spoken.